So the first question here is, what is the definition of holy? Great question, because I'm talking all this time, an hour, about holiness as a sign of the church, as a mark of the church, and I never once said what I meant by it. Thank you. It's a good question. It's not easy to define these things, right? Because they're obviously, for example, Scripture says that God is holy. Isaiah, holy, holy, holy. He had a glimpse of the heavenly liturgy. The angels are proclaiming that God is holy. Right? So holiness is an attribute of God. And the things that pertain to God are said to be holy. And so a distinction is made between what is holy or sacred and what is profane, of the earth, of society, of man. And so to be holy in one sense means to belong to God, to be consecrated to God. But why is God said to be holy? Well, God is free from sin, from impurity, from God is love, and everything that He does comes from that one love. And to be unholy, to be profane, what does that mean? To belong to the earth, to have, to lack that purity of God. So that would be one way to explain it. Now we talk about holiness, and so what does it mean then for us to be holy? Right. So it would mean essentially to be holy is to have charity. More holiness means more charity, because it's charity that unites us to God. So if God is holy, and the things that belong to God are holy, we become holy, ultimately, not by rites and rituals, but by belonging to God through the union of charity. In other words, by loving God above all things, and our neighbor as ourselves, for God's sake. Right? So charity is the essence of holiness. And everything else that we do to grow in holiness is to help us grow in charity. So for example, the sacraments are holy. Why? Because they give us the life of grace, which is the life of charity. The religious life is holy, because a person enters religious life to grow in charity, to grow in singleness of heart, so that our heart goes to love of God and love of neighbor, like God's heart, like God. So to be holy is essentially to have charity grow ever more in us. So that would be how I would answer that. Right? And the church is holy then because her life is the life of charity. She has the source of charity, Christ, and that His life flows to us through her sacraments, above all, the Eucharist and baptism. There's a lot more that could be said about that. So holiness, right, is essentially perfection in charity, perfection in love. Okay. And that's why those works of mercy are so important in showing that the church is holy. Right? That those works of fraternal charity, like Blessed Teresa of Calcutta. And we say the holiness of the moral law. Why is the moral law holy? Well, because the moral law all flows from the double commandment of charity. Right? Every commandment is about charity and leads to charity. The Church's teaching on the sanctity of human life is all about charity. Charity towards the most vulnerable. The Church's teaching on matrimony is all about charity. Charity between the spouses. The indissolubility of marriage. So the Church's teaching is holy, her means of sanctification, and it all comes from charity and leads to it. Okay, that was a great question. Thank you. I should have... Here's a more difficult question. Catholics often mix up salvation and sanctification, which means they misunderstand the role of the Mosaic covenant, which is about sanctification, not salvation. Please comment. I think that's Ethel back there. Difficult question. The fact is that both Israel and the church are all about sanctification and about salvation. And of course, salvation and sanctification do go together, right? We're saved how? By becoming sanctified. In other words, we're saved by getting sin forgiven and getting the life of God, the life of charity, which is sanctity, holiness, in us. Right? So salvation comes through sanctification. I don't know if this is what Ethel had in mind, but we'll get to him afterwards. Salvation comes through sanctification and is inseparable from it. Nobody can be saved without being sanctified. But of course, there are grades of sanctification. Right? So everyone who's in a state of grace has been sanctified and saved by that sanctification. Right? They've been saved by having charity in them and having their mortal sins forgiven. Right? So we're saved by sanctification, and the more we grow in charity, the more that sanctification increases. Right? And the whole purpose of the church isn't that we just kind of squeak by and get into heaven, but no, that we become more and more like Christ, who is sanctity in person. Right? So the whole purpose of the Christian life is to grow in sanctification. And of course, that was the goal of the life of Israel, was to grow in sanctification. And thus, all the laws of the Old Testament, Leviticus and Deuteronomy, are about sanctification, to be holy as God is holy. And that holiness manifests itself, in different ways. It manifests itself in the Ten Commandments, which aren't just a minimum, but there's no end to them, as it were. Right? There's no end to loving God. There's no end to respecting life, and etc. And the other commandments give more detail about how to practice charity, and thus about sanctification. The ritual laws of the Old Testament, the liturgical laws, are about ritual sanctification. And we have the same in the church, a sanctification that comes through the liturgy of the church and her sacraments. So I would say that both Israel and the church are all about sanctification, and that salvation comes through that sanctification, but we don't want to just aim for the minimum, but for the maximum, which is holiness. Is that, did you want to add anything to that, Ethel?
It's just with the dialogue between Jews and Catholics, often they're talking about two different things, because Catholics seem to be very focused on salvation. And I guess it's like you're saying, you connect it very much together, salvation and sanctification. Mm-hmm. Yeah? But when Jews are talking about the law of Moses, they're not talking about salvation at all. They're talking about sanctification. In fact, salvation is something they're looking forward to in the Messiah. Yeah? We look forward to salvation. It's a verse in the Bible. So every day Jews are looking forward salvation, and the Talmud teaches when one dies, one of the key questions you're asked when you get to the other side is, did you look for salvation? Mm-hmm. Whereas in a Catholic sense, salvation is a free gift, isn't it? In Jesus Christ.
Right.
And then sanctification is growing in holiness. Mm-hmm. The law of Moses is not about salvation, so when people are...
But in reality, don't you think that it is? In other words, I would say that in reality, the law of Moses, it is about salvation, because it teaches the law of charity by which we're saved. In other words, we're saved by Christ, right? Christ's redemption. But we appropriate that. That informs our life insofar as our life is governed by charity. And the law of Moses and the law of the church seeks to make that charity concrete in our lives. So I would say that the two go together.
In a sense they do, they go together. But when you don't clarify, I think some Catholics don't even see a difference between the two.
I think the reason for that is because for Jews, the Messiah is seen to be still future, and thus the work of salvation hasn't yet been done. Right? And we know that work of salvation has been done, but that work of salvation doesn't sanctify us automatically, right? But we have to, even though we've been objectively saved by Christ, we have to have that salvation applied to us through His grace, and that means striving for sanctity more each day.
But what happens is that people then think that a Jew is like keeping commandments in order to be saved. The Jews aren't keeping the commandments in order to be saved, are keeping the commandments because they see it as a method of sanctification. The commandment becomes a vessel for holiness. That's not something, if you don't do that, you're going to be doomed. And if I do this, I'll be saved. And so that's where I think people get mixed up when they're dialoguing, especially with Jews, because Jews are talking about something different to what Christians imagine they're saying. Because of this, in their mind, salvation equals sanctification.
Right. Yeah, I think the key is that we don't want to shoot for the minimum. It's not just like a yes or no thing, but you have to aim to have your life. You have to aim for sanctity, which means going beyond beyond the simple letter of the law, but to seek to live the law. Okay.
With the American Catechism, there's a phrase which they're going to remove because people became confused, and it says that the covenant with Moses was valid for the Jews. Yeah. In the Catechism. Now, a lot of Catholics think they're taking it out because the Church has decided that's the wrong statement. But the bishop's spokesman actually said that isn't the reason we're taking it out, it's because people are misunderstanding it. Because the average Catholic, when they read that, because they're not distinguishing between salvation and sanctification, they think that statement means you're saying there's two ways to salvation. But the covenant with Moses that is valid for the Jews is nothing to do with another way of salvation. It's the same way of salvation, it's in the Messiah. Whether you're a Catholic or a Jew, salvation is in the Messiah. But the covenant with Moses is valid for the Jewish people for all time because it's their way of sanctification, not of salvation.
This might take us a little too far astray, but
you see why it's important to clarify the difference.
Right. In other words, no one can save us. No man can save himself, right? In other words, works of the law don't save any of us directly because sin can only be forgiven by one who has a divine dignity like the Word incarnate, right? So in other words, only the God-man can save mankind from sin. But we have to participate in His work by corresponding to grace. And that always means that we obey the law such as to avoid mortal sin. And that would be true also for Jews as well as obviously for every man. In other words, every man, even though we're saved by Christ, we still have to cooperate with grace, avoiding mortal sin, which is given us by the commandments. And so in that sense, we are saved by following the law in that sense. Right? We have to avoid mortal sin. And then we're saved by growing in charity, by living those commandments ever more fully in charity. And that will be true also of Jew and Gentile, right? Of the Jew and those in the church. But it's true that they had a different, obviously the Jews had a ceremonial law that was for them. A law of the liturgy, a law of how to live life in a particular way that was binding only on the Jewish people, right? But then the question of it being binding on them still today is that I would disagree there. In other words, Jews aren't still bound today once they come to recognize Christ as the Savior by that way of sanctification in the Old Testament. But we'll talk about that afterwards.
Christ said when he was asked by the Pharisees what is the greatest commandment, and he said, love,
right.
Deuteronomy, which is from the Old Testament. But he clarified that those are the two greatest commandments, which actually embellishes the Ten Commandments. So that was his way of saying, at least that's how I see it, as a way of sanctification through those two commandments.
Right. Right. All sanctification comes through the double commandment of charity. Right? And all the law depends on that.
Right. And so that right there, he brings the Jewish covenant into the new covenant.
Okay. Another question. Is the church a moving body continually moving towards the end times? Yes, exactly. In other words, the church that's what we mean by the church is pilgrim. It's the pilgrim church. The church militant, the church here on earth, is a church in constant expectation, as Israel was in expectation. But a different, in other words, Israel was an expectation for the coming of the Messiah, and the Messianic age, and then the world to come. The church has the Messiah, is in the Messianic age, but still is an expectation for the final consummation of the church in glory, the world to come. So the church, yes, is moving towards that. And she's moving also towards an ever greater fullness of the peoples of the earth. Right? So she's moving to extend her influence ever more as much as she can. And that's why the church is always missionary. And she also, she strives to have that life that she has extend more towards all men. Another aspect of the question, what is the difference between the church and the New Jerusalem? Well, the New Jerusalem could be a name for the church, but Revelation uses that image for the church triumphant in the end times. So John in the Apocalypse sees the New Jerusalem descending from heaven, immaculate. Right? So that would be the church triumphant in glory. But the New Jerusalem and the church are one. Right? The church is the New Jerusalem, but the New Testament uses that phrase especially for the church triumphant in heaven. Another question. Do you discern some error in modern society that causes many young people born and raised in the church to leave it after citing bad or insensitive pastoral care, often of priests, or scandals with priests, etc.? And it's understandable, right? It's understandable because our contact with the church comes through people, right? And so if we're given a bad example, it's understandable that people leave. But nevertheless, it's a great error. It's a great error because the holiness of the church doesn't consist essentially in us, in the members. The holiness of the church is in her founder, Christ, and in the life-giving force of the sacraments that he gave to the church, and in the holiness of her doctrine. So the church doesn't lose her holiness because of bad pastors or bad examples. And so for people to leave the church because they've met up with sinners inside the church, well, that's a great error. Because the church doesn't say she's holy because everyone in the church is holy. And that's why Jesus had one of the 12 apostles betray him. He permitted it. I mean, obviously he didn't cause it. But he permitted Judas to be among the 12 and to betray him, to show us that we're not to be scandalized when we meet other people who are a little bit like Judas today. Right? So it's a great error to leave the church because of a bad experience like that. But it is understandable. And that's why each one of us is called to be a model to all those who we come in contact with.
So could you say, like in Jesus' time, generally speaking, the people were caught up in this world, not into supernatural or mystical world. Christ always spoke. That's why many people had a hard time understanding what he meant, because he used examples that they could get, the shepherd, all the things that they. But he was always speaking, even when he talked to Pilate, of the other mystical body. And that's why even today, as we sit here, a lot of us have a hard time, because they must forget the flesh and think only of the supernatural. Right.
Good point. In other words, the church is essentially a supernatural society. Right? It's not a temporal society for temporal purposes, etc. And we see that the apostles had a hard time grasping that. Right? They were expecting a temporal kingdom of Israel that get rid of the Romans, etc. And in every time and place where people have the same expectations because of our worldly interests and tendencies. And so it's hard for us, and it's always hard, to grasp the holiness of the church, which is something essentially supernatural. It's not directly visible. It becomes visible in works of charity, right? And that's why those works of charity are so important. Okay. This is a difficult question here, very difficult. I can't answer it. Are there any circumstances which a cradle Catholic who has received the sacraments and formation in the faith can nevertheless be invincibly ignorant or become invincibly ignorant? Now, this is a very important question because we all know many people who are fallen away Catholics, and many of them are loved ones. And so can we hope for them, or what should we think about them? And of course the answer is you can always hope for everyone, right? So you can always hope, and you must always pray. But you don't want to have so much hope that you don't pray for them. But you don't want to have so little hope that you despair of them, right? And so there has to be a balance there. And so the answer is there's no doubt that they can be saved if they come back, right? And so people who fall away from the church, independently of whether they're invincibly ignorant or not, we want to pray for them so that they come back. Right? What if they don't come back and they die in that state? Right? So that's the question. Could we think that there could be times in which they're invincibly ignorant and thus they could be saved? And the answer is yes, but we don't know how many. God only knows. It's obviously much easier for someone to be invincibly ignorant who hasn't received the same benefits that those people have received. Okay, so there's a general law. The more that you've received, the more is expected of us. Right? And so it's a great grace to be a cradle Catholic. It's a great grace to have received the faith from youth. But we all know what happens. I mean, catechetical programs are very often terrible. And Catholic schools very often don't adequately transmit the faith. And so it could happen that a person going to Catholic school doesn't ever encounter Catholicism correctly. Could they be invincibly ignorant? Yes. God only knows.
We have a whole generation of people that have not learned the faith.
Right.
A whole generation.
Right.
40.
Mm-hmm. Right.
But you can
It hasn't been
also,
transmitted.
what I do, because I have that
Mhm.
experience in my life, with fallen away Catholics, not really, and also members who are not Catholic,
Mhm.
and who are not baptized. St. Monica is a good
Right,
one to
right.
as for intercession.
Right, right. But look at St. Augustine as an interesting case. St. Augustine didn't think that he was invincibly ignorant. He knew that he wasn't invincibly ignorant.
Also, if you pray from St. Bridget and
Mhm.
St. Elizabeth of Hungary,
Right.
very simple, pray in
Mm-hmm.
reflecting on the blood lost on the way to Calvary,
Mhm.
and it's very simple.
Mhm.
Once a day,
Mm-hmm.
in Our Father, Hail
Mhm.
Mary, and a Glory be. It is from
Mhm.
a vision, and you do this for 3 years. You are guaranteed through these that you, and I think down to the 4th generation, will be saved. So there's a lot to be said about praying
Uh-huh.
and then having the saints intercede for us.
Right, right. I think that's a great point about St. Monica. Right? She was such a great model of that perseverance in prayer for her son who had fallen away. Right? But she was, right. Excellent. So yes, they can be invincibly ignorant, especially in our time. Right? There's no doubt about it. But we shouldn't. The fact that they may have been invincibly ignorant doesn't mean that we don't have to be as persevering in prayer as St. Monica.
And it puts a greater burden on us to try to instruct the ignorant, because that's one of our works of mystery.
That's right. Right. It's a great right. So
Great charity.
right. So just as these corporal works of mercy, the spiritual works of mercy, teaching those who don't know the faith, who never were properly exposed. In other words, giving a good example of what Catholicism really means to people. This is a stupendous act of mercy. Very good.
What about those people who have been well instructed, but they just don't believe it? Out of all honesty, they can't believe it's true. They might have been instructed in it, but
Right. Well, there can be different.
In life, they
Right.
recognize wisdom as true.
Right, no, that's absolutely true. That this kind of thing happens. We know it's not just people who've been badly catechized that fall away, but sometimes people who are well catechized. And there can be different reasons. There's many reasons, I suppose, as there are kinds of people. Sometimes the reasons for this are moral reasons. You know, some of these examples make you should inspire a fear of God. I mean, there was a great Catholic philosopher, Max Scheler, that the Pope John Paul II wrote his dissertation on. And he was a Catholic, and he converted Dietrich von Hildebrandt to the Catholic faith. They were best friends. And he fell in love with his secretary. And he was married, and he left his wife. He started this relation with his secretary, and it's not surprising that he lost the faith. Because sometimes when you don't live according to the faith, even though you don't directly sin against the faith, nevertheless, if you don't live according to it, you end up losing it. So things like that happen sometimes for moral reasons. Sometimes it can be neglect of our formation. In other words, a person could have received a good formation in early youth, but if we don't keep up forming our faith as we grow older, according to our state in life and our ability, then that's another reason why we can lose the faith. Very often it happens in college, and so the reason for this would be, again, could be habitual sexual vice. There's a phenomenon called spiritual blindness that the fathers speak about, that they particularly associate with sexual sins. And obviously that's very common in our society, right? Things like pornography, etc. And so there can be all kinds of reasons. It could be that they've come in contact with people who are all fired up for the faith who are Protestants. And they didn't find that example among their Catholic. That's obviously, I mean, they're all different types of circumstances. Some involve more culpability, some involve less. Only God knows, right? But we need to pray for all of them. So it's very complicated. One last question. The number of people who are saved is known only to God. Right. But Matthew 7, verse 13, speaks about the narrow gate. Enter by the narrow gate. The gate is wide and the way is easy that leads to destruction, and those who enter by it are many. For the gate is narrow and the way is hard that leads to life, and those who find it are few. And so the question is, what is the church's current view regarding numbers and percentage of those saved? And it's interesting that the gospel today was precisely the parallel in Luke of that same text. Jesus speaking about the narrow gate. All right, so the fact is, the church doesn't teach anything about the percentages. Right? It's left to Jesus. Jesus said what he said, and the church doesn't know anything more than what Jesus said.
What does the Gallup poll think?
Okay, right. The Gallup poll won't be much use for us here. Right? Only God knows. So this is a mystery. This is something. The only thing that we're given is what Jesus said in the Gospels. It seems that what he's saying in the Gospels isn't such as to lead you to hope that all are saved. Right? It's not such. He could have said that. He could have said, hope that all are saved. But he doesn't. He says, the gate is narrow, and those who find it are few. And there are obvious reasons for this. Because of what we said before about salvation and sanctification. In other words, the Christian life is hard. It's a life of heroic charity. And therefore we have to strive. St. Paul says, strive like those who run in the Olympics or something. That the Christian life is a life of heroism. And we're to strive not just to get in under in the bottom, the minimum. That would be a kind of legalism or minimalism. But what we want to do is to strive ever more to lead Christ's life. And thus, it's a maximalism. And that's what these sayings should inspire us with. Right? We don't know the numbers. And I certainly think that we could hope that in a Christian society, in a truly Christian society, the number of those lost would be very few. Right? That's got to be our goal, is to help society to be such that few are lost. But I think there's no doubt that if society is not Christian, is much less Christian, becomes less Christian, those that are saved will be fewer, and those that are lost will be more. In other words, it's not the same if you take, for example, Aztec society. Right? If you live in Aztec society, I think the number of those lost will be greater, right? Because you're not taught about the love of God. If you live in a Christian, right? So our goal should be, it's not something fixed, right? That in every age and in every century, in every country, 73% or something like that. But there's tremendous variation depending on our cooperation. And the saints, they bring lots of people with them, right? So one saint can, who really corresponds, can make a tremendous difference in all those that are with them.
There's the other part of the New Testament where the apostles asked Christ, how can anybody be saved? He says only through God.
Right, that's right, it's impossible. It's humanly impossible. Right, and he gives that incredible example about the eye of the needle and the camel. But these things are impossible for men, but they're possible for God. But the fact that they're possible for God doesn't mean that everyone is automatically saved, because we have to cooperate with that grace. He's got to take the first step. He's got to do the work. He's got to give me the grace first. And he does that. But we have to cooperate with that grace, and that cooperation is essentially cooperating in charity. Right? In other words, corresponding with charity. So it's the great mystery, but it's a mystery in which we're not given any security, but we're given a charge, and that is to struggle, to strive, to get through that narrow gate, and to bring lots of others with us. So on that note, I think we can close.